There are things that occur amid a quiet life that no map can ever foretell. Like a nameless wave, like a gaze across the sea, or, like a lioness appearing in the middle of the ocean. Nick was not seeking the extraordinary. He had lived long enough to know that reality has no place for the fantastic. Since the day he left the Navy and lost his beloved wife, he had chosen to live like a calm sea, no crests, no collisions, only the repetition of routines anchoring a man with nothing left to believe in. Yet that morning, when the old wooden boat drifted farther than usual and the fishing line stayed empty, the sea returned to him not fish but a creature that should not have been there. A lioness, a drenched soul, swimming between salt and death. And she chose him. In that moment, Nick was no longer a former officer, no longer merely a survivor. He was the only one standing between life and death for a strange being whose eyes looked more human than any he had ever seen. This is not a story about wildlife. Nor is it merely a survival journey. This is a story about trust, instinct, and what happens when two wounded creatures recognize each other in an ocean with no way out. And that was the day the sea brought Morella to him. On a Tuesday morning, the sea was unusually quiet. Tiny waves, as if half asleep, couldn't be bothered to slap against the faded wooden sides of Nick's boat, a man who had stepped away from the open ocean yet had never truly left it. The boat, old but sturdy, drifted slowly across the deep blue water like an unfaded streak of memory. Nick stood at the bow, hand gripping his fishing rod, eyes fixed on the horizon where mist still clung to the surface. He didn't really want to catch fish. He hadn't truly wanted to do anything since Marie died 2 years ago. Marie had been a writer, a woman who once penned gentle tales about friendships between humans and creatures no one dared believe existed. And Nick, the sailor husband, had simply smiled then, saying, "Whatever you write is beautiful, even if it never happens." But now, with no Marie to talk to and no Navy left to serve, Nick's days drifted like the calm sea, slow, colorless, and seemingly endless. That morning he had steered the boat farther than usual, not for the fish, but because he was seeking absolute silence, the kind only the open ocean grants, where the waves cease whispering and only the distant beat of one's own heart remains. The fishing line trembled. Nick gave it a quick tug, empty. Again, a second hook hauled up bearing nothing but salt and shattered hope. He was about to set the rod down and sip another swallow of cold coffee when something moved within his sight. Slow, very slow. A bulk slid beneath the surface, too large for a seal, too sleek for a dolphin. Nick squinted through the bright glare. For a moment, his heart skipped a beat. It was swimming straight for the boat. At first, Nick thought it a trick of light, an old net, a drifting log, perhaps even a stray whale. But when the creature surfaced and amber eyes met his, every shred of reason in Nick's mind seemed swept away. The silence he had sought shattered like waves against rock. On that briny morning sea, a lioness was swimming toward him. And the strangest thing was, she didn't look fierce. She looked as though she were pleading. The open sea around Nick suddenly slowed, as if time itself had run aground. Every sound drew back, the gulls' cries, the rustle of wind, even the boat's wooden creak blurred behind the rapid thump of his heart. Ahead, the creature rose inch by inch from the water, the head of a lioness, soaked so thoroughly that her golden mane hung like rotted roots adrift in brine. Nick stood transfixed, hand still gripping the fishing rod by reflex. The animal, unmistakable, was swimming straight toward his boat. A lion, a creature meant for the African savanna, not the chill waters dozens of nautical miles from shore. She cut through the sea not quickly but steadily, as though every kick was a conscious choice. Head slightly lifted, drenched mane plastered to her neck. Her gaze stayed locked on him. In those eyes was no ferocity, no threat, only fatigue. And something unnamed, something almost pleading. Nick stepped back instinctively. All his life he had trained to sense danger, had weathered Pacific storms and a war people no longer called by name. He knew peril. This was its opposite. This wasn't a hunt, it was a cry for help. The lioness was now only a few meters away. Her forepaws swept weakly, carving small circles on the vast sea. Her body no longer floated straight but listed, drifting. She was spent, sinking. Nick snatched up the radio, abandoned long ago because signals died this far out. Stand by for signal. Only the static hiss of hopelessness replied. No signal. No one. Only him. And a drowning lioness. Nick glanced around the boat. Reason said, start the engine. Leave. His heart, the thing silent since Marie's death, whispered instead. She needs you. He bit his lip, bent down, and pulled out a neatly coiled rope ladder. Hands trembling, he flung it over the gunwale, its rungs dangling above the water like a fragile thread of hope. The lioness looked at it, then at him. Slowly, she lifted her 4 paws and clawed at the rope. The first attempt slipped free. The second, the boat lurched and Nick lost his footing. But on the third, she threw her shoulder, her shaking body, into the effort and hauled herself upward. Claws scraping fiberglass rang out like a cry in a desert, sharp. Unnerving. Nick did not flinch. He stood motionless, holding his breath. Then, like a creature stepping out of myth, the lioness dragged her exhausted form onto the deck, collapsing onto the wooden planks in ragged breaths. She lay there, fur clotted with blood and salt. A wild body. Human eyes. No name yet, but Nick felt she needed one, something to pin this absurd, sacred instant in memory. Morella, he whispered. The name emerged without reason, only feeling. And Morella, the lioness from the sea, did not look away from him. Nick crouched beside the gunwale, keeping just enough distance not to alarm the wild creature collapsed before him. He had never imagined he would one day find himself like this, a former naval officer. Bare-handed, out in the middle of the ocean with a drenched, dying lioness on the deck of his weather-worn boat. Morella did not stir. Her large body, wet, cold, exhausted, lay still, as though every breath were a struggle. Blood from somewhere on her right foreleg kept oozing, spreading into a dark red smear across the sun-bleached planks. The fur at her neck was tangled, heavy with seawater, and the skin beneath her belly rose and fell faintly like a wavering ripple. Yet what Nick could not tear his eyes from was her gaze. No rancor, no panic, only exhaustion pushed to desperation, and a fragile glimmer clinging to him. That glimmer was trust. Nick edged back, rummaging for an old towel and the aluminum bowl he used for baitfish. He scooped fresh water from the jug and set the bowl a yard from Morella. The lioness did not move. No one ever taught me how to give first aid to a lion in the middle of the sea. Nick muttered, the words slipping out after days of silence. For the first time he felt compelled to speak, though he knew she could not understand. Morella shifted slightly, her head turned toward the bowl, then she lapped the water ravenously, spilling it across the wooden deck. Each swallow seemed to rake her salt-burned throat, all the while her eyes never left him, as if asking, why haven't you left? Nick bent lower to inspect the wound, a long gash near the shoulder joint, deep, torn open as though by an iron hook or something jagged. Not a bite, not an accident, a wound inflicted by humans. Perhaps a harpoon, perhaps a tool meant for torment. And then, as if death itself were not enough, someone had taken her out into open water and abandoned her. The thought chilled his gut. Marie, his wife, had once written fairy tales about lonely animals cast out by humans yet finding someone to trust. Back then Nick had laughed. There's no such thing as a lion trusting a person, darling. But now a lioness lay before him, trusting him, because she had no one else. He gently placed the towel over Morella's foreleg, wiping away the smeared blood. She flinched, lips lifting to reveal her fangs, then relaxed. No bite, no resistance, only trembling endurance. Nick suddenly realized, she had overcome the wild instinct of her species to survive. Now it was his turn to overcome the instinct of fear to save her. In that brief moment, as the early light glimmered on Morella's soaked back and he pressed the first pad of gauze to her wound, two beings, one human, one beast, understood that they were no longer alone. Nick stood motionless on the deck, fingers clamped around a blood-soaked roll of gauze, his gaze fixed on the lioness curled amid tilting patches of sunlight. No one, absolutely no one, could explain this sight, an exhausted, wounded lioness panting on an old fishing boat in the heart of the ocean. And a solitary former naval officer trembling not from fear, but because he knew he must make an impossible decision. Reason shouted, sound the alarm. Call wildlife rescue. Call the Coast Guard. Call anyone authorized to handle this. But the phone had no signal. The radio issued only the static rasp of a bygone era's dying breath. He, and the lioness, were two isolated lives on the vast sea. With no one but each other. Nick looked at Marilla again. She lay still, unmoving, her head rested against the planks, ears twitching at every gust of wind. Beneath the soaked fur was a being fighting to keep its breath. Clinging to life with a fragile trust placed wholly in a stranger. If Marie were still alive, she would have embraced Marilla long ago, given her a name, placed gentle hands on that tangled mane, and spoken fairy tale words. But Marie was gone, only Nick remained, and a decision that made every part of him howl in protest, while his heart nodded quietly. He could not consign her to an iron cage, could not bear to see a creature that had dared swim an ocean trussed up, labeled dangerous, and ending her days in a cold administrative report. No. Nick drew a deep breath, climbed into the cabin, and pulled out a battered old nautical chart. His eyes settled on a tiny dot to the north, an abandoned Navy resupply dock he had once used during the war. Now deserted, no cameras, no people, only forest, rock, and a small mooring hidden behind a sheer cliff. He would take Marilla there, wait until her wound improved, then think further. How? He did not yet know. But at least it was a chance. Nick stepped back outside, wiped the cold sweat from his brow, and gently set another jug of water beside Marilla. He turned the key. The engine roared after a few reluctant squeals, the harsh sound echoing across the empty sea. The boat shuddered, then began to change course. Wind whipped his face, but Nick did not look back. Marilla stirred slightly, not in fear, but as though sensing the shift. Her eyes, the eyes of a survivor of the open ocean, quietly followed every movement of the helmsman. She did not know where he was taking her, yet she did not resist. Inside the wheelhouse, Nick's hands still trembled, not because Marilla might spring up, but because he knew that from this moment on, the lioness's fate was no longer some strange occurrence he had stumbled upon, but his own responsibility. Nick's boat sliced through the waves like a silent arrow aimed at a forgotten past, the old Navy resupply dock tucked deep among the northern cliffs. The engine roared in heavy pulses, as though it were shouldering a secret far too large to glide lightly over the water. Aft on the deck, Marilla still lay there, motionless, yet alive. Each breath she drew was a quiet protest against death. Her tangled mane was matted, the dried blood had turned into dark streaks. Nick kept glancing back, eyes glued to that massive form, terrified she might roll off the deck with a sudden lurch, or die before he could do anything. A lion should not survive at sea, should not appear on his boat, should not trust him. And yet, she was here. The wind began to rise. Distant swells hammered the hull in steady beats, as if testing the resolve of both man and beast. Nick clenched his teeth, corrected course, and spun the wheel to skirt a reef he still remembered from the map in his mind. Skills long dormant returned, not to save himself, but to safeguard the life lying there. He looked back. And just then, Marilla moved for the first time. Her heavy body arched slightly. Both forelegs stiffened as she tried to push herself up. But the deck was now too narrow, too slanted, and every motion brought pain. A screech like metal scraping wood rang out, Marilla's sharp claws slipping. The boat tilted farther. Her great body began to slide toward the rail. Nick lunged without thinking. He grabbed a spare mooring line, whipped it into a quick loop, and flung it toward Marilla. She didn't understand, but the light tug of the rope shifted her weight just enough to keep her from tumbling overboard. For a few frantic seconds her forelegs thrashed, claws gouging the wooden planks, until, in a final haul, she dragged herself back to where she had lain. Nick gasped for breath. He stared at his own scraped hands. The rope still clenched tight. Marilla collapsed again, so exhausted she could no longer breathe through her nose. Her mouth hung open, tongue lolling past blood-stained teeth. Yet her eyes, still open, still fixed on him, held no anger, no roar, only acceptance, presence, trust. Throughout his military life, Nick had pulled friends from burning hulls, led strangers off tsunami edges. But never, not once, had he felt a moment as perilous and sacred as gripping that lifeline tied to a lion in the middle of the ocean. He lowered himself beside the rail, sitting face to face with Marilla. They said nothing, there was no need. He knew, if she slipped overboard, he would never forgive himself. And now, together, they had survived their first life or death climb back to the deck. They were no longer man and beast. Only two surviving creatures, clinging to each other amid wind, waves, and absurdity, awaiting a shore that had yet to be named. Evening descended like a whisper laced with warning. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a copper blaze across the water, bathing the boat and the lioness in a haze of amber twilight. As if everything that had happened today belonged to some fevered dream. But blood doesn't dream, and the wound was still there. Nick knelt beside Marilla, gently brushing aside the salt-encrusted fur clinging to her injured right shoulder. Beneath the matted hair was a deep, crescent-shaped tear, jagged, unnatural, as if not caused by a bite or accident of nature, but by metal, rough, cold, and deliberate. Something small clung to the wound's edge, a fray of synthetic red rope. The kind commonly found on dockyards, or aboard illegal transport vessels. Nick froze. This wasn't a case of an animal accidentally falling into the sea. This wasn't an escape from a zoo. Someone had brought her out here. And left her, bleeding. His head grew hot, not from the setting sun, but from a surge of rage. Like a riptide rising from within. Not only at the cruelty of it, but at the thought that this creature had been reduced to a thing. Something discardable once it no longer had value. He remembered Morella's eyes when she first climbed aboard, not fearful, but pleading, because before she was a beast, before she became a myth adrift in the ocean, Morella had been something betrayed. Nick stepped into the cabin, rummaging through the battered first aid kit he'd long neglected since his open sea days. There was still a roll of gauze, a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, a few faded bandages. He soaked a cloth in warm water and returned. Morella hadn't moved, only her ears twitched slightly as he approached. Nick paused, extending a hand for her to smell, just as Marie used to do with wild animals when they were young. The lioness tilted her head, her nose brushing his hand, a small gesture. But it felt like a ritual between two beings who had crossed the boundary of fear. He began cleaning the wound. Peroxide hissed white bubbles over dried blood. Morella flinched, gave a low growl, lips pulling back slightly. But she didn't claw, didn't roar, didn't run. She endured. Nick recognized that look. He'd seen it before in young soldiers. In widows saying goodbye at the docks. The look of someone who has endured too much pain to resist anymore, who simply continues to exist. And something inside him cracked. Not loud, not violent, but deep. He whispered, more to both of them than to her. No one should be treated like this. Not a human, not an animal. He kept wrapping the wound, loop after loop, hands trembling, equal parts fear, fury, and compassion. Morella blinked slowly. She didn't need to speak. Her eyes said it all. I know, but I'm here now. And Nick understood. From that moment on, Morella's fate was tied to his own lifeline. This was no longer just a mission to save a wild animal. It was a journey to preserve something still pure, still worthy of trust, in a world that had lost too much of both. Night fell over the sea like a curtain of deep velvet, draping itself over the old boat and the two survivors upon it, as if they were lost characters from a forgotten play adrift in the ocean. No voices, no shoreline lights, only the steady rhythm of waves against the hull and the low, labored breath of Morella, merging with the slowing heartbeat in Nick's chest. He sat there, back resting against the mast, eyes turned skyward toward a sky glittering with stars. On the deck before him, Morella lay curled up, a large, damp golden form wrapped in coarse towels and hastily wound gauze. Beneath those bandages was a wound, of flesh. Yes, but also of trust. Once torn open, Nick said nothing. There was nothing to say. Because from the moment he placed his hand on that wound, a silent pact had been formed. No contract, no rules, only a quiet understanding between two souls who had lost too much to still cling to the old lines dividing human and beast. Morella remained awake. He knew it, even with her eyes closed. Her ears followed every shift, every gust of wind, because like him, she had never learned how to sleep soundly with a wounded heart. Nick reached for more fresh water and gently placed the bowl near her muzzle. She didn't drink, but when he sat back down, Morella turned her head slowly. Her eyes cracking open in the dark, no longer pleading. No longer panicked. Only, present. As if she were saying, I know you won't leave. And she was right. Nick had spent hundreds of sleepless hours at sea, amid storms. Amid war. But this was the first time he stayed awake beside someone where the silence felt so profound. No stories. No explanations. Survival had become their only shared language. He thought of Marie. She once said, real love doesn't come from the things we say. It comes from the things we endure together. In silence. At the time, he had laughed, dismissing it as a line from a sentimental novel. But now, in the middle of this ocean night, he understood. Marella, the lioness from the sea, sat with him in a silence made not of peace, but of resistance. No one asked, why? No one needed to explain. They were simply living, in the same place. At the same time, with the same unseen fracture running through their souls. A strong gust passed over the deck. Marella flinched slightly, her tail brushing instinctively toward him, seeking warmth. Nick didn't react outwardly, but inside, something in his chest gave a small, silent pull, not out of fear, but because he knew, from this night forward, he could never return to the man he once was. He had seen something few ever do. A lioness who did not roar. Eyes that did not threaten. A creature that didn't beg for life, but reached for someone. And he had answered, not with words, but with a promise left unspoken. Dawn painted the sea in a cold, gray light, not radiant, not joyful, just enough to distinguish night from day. Nick sat at the wooden steering bench, hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee he'd brewed 3 times before finally taking a sip. His mind felt heavy, as though he himself were carrying Marella on his back. On the deck, Marella had moved, not far, just a few steps, but it was the first sign of recovery. She had dragged herself toward a patch of sunlight, lying on her side, the wounded shoulder still carefully bandaged. Her eyes were half closed, but her ears stood alert, attuned to every shift of the breeze. Nick watched her for a long time, a question rising in him, one he had been avoiding since yesterday. What will I do once she's better? He knew what the world would expect. Call the authorities. File a report. Hand her over. A lioness found at sea couldn't possibly remain a private matter. She would be labeled dangerous, even as a victim, and that would be the end, not just for Marella, but for the fragile bond between them. A thread so delicate it might not survive the violence of being torn apart. Nick pictured her in a cage, fluorescent lights, tranquilizer guns, cold voices behind thick glass. No sea, no wind, no eyes that listened, no freedom. Then he looked at the lioness sleeping nearby, like a silent block of gold upon the wooden floor. She had chosen him, not because he was strong, not because he understood wild animals, but because she felt safe. And he had chosen her too. Not with reason, with instinct. Nick rose abruptly, heart pounding. He couldn't give her up. Couldn't let others, no matter their titles in science or conservation, decide the fate of something sacred that had unfolded between them. He opened the steel cabinet in the cabin, where he kept old maps, a worn nautical log, tools once used to ferry soldiers to remote islands during the war. His fingers scanned coordinates, then stopped at a small, forgotten circle near the coast. Naval Resupply Station Number 7 decommissioned. It was the only place he knew that no one remembered. An old dock, swallowed by time, cloaked in cliffs and forest. No signals, no cameras, no questions. Just get there, he thought. Just get there, and I'll have time. Marella will have a chance. Not long after, he pulled out an old satellite phone, something he hadn't touched in years. A gift from a former comrade, now working as a guard at a private sanctuary up north. Not government-run, no media, no cages. He dialed, waited. The ringing felt as heavy as stone. Al? A rough, gravelly voice answered on the other end. Nick took a deep breath. I've got a creature. Needs help. No time. Can't explain over the phone. A long silence. Then the voice said, bring it. I won't ask questions. Just get here before someone else finds out. The call ended with Nick's sigh. Not of relief, but because he knew, from this point on, there was no turning back. He returned to the deck. Marella's eyes were open now, watching him. No words. Just that gaze, the one that had once pleaded. Now simply waiting. Nick stepped closer, gently sat down beside her. "We're not going to surrender," he said softly, like speaking to a wounded soldier. "We're going to find freedom." And Marilla, though she couldn't understand the words, understood him. At midday, Nick restarted the engine. Its roar came out hoarse and strained, as if even the machine was weary after 3 days of motionless waiting on the sea. Marilla lay on the aft deck, shrouded beneath 2 layers of tarpaulin and a makeshift windbreak net Nick had fastened earlier. She looked more like an oversized piece of luggage than a living creature. Perhaps that would help avert suspicion, should any passerby happen upon them. But when Nick looked up at the sky, a knot tightened in his chest. Far out on the horizon, a gray streak of cloud crept in like a blunt knife, slow but inescapable. The wind shifted. The waves began to turn over. The scent of an approaching storm, metal and salt, rose into the air. A scent he'd learned to recognize since he was a young naval recruit. Nick glanced at the route chart. If the weather held, he could reach the old supply station by dusk. But with a sky like that, he knew this was no longer a calm voyage. It was a race against time and against nature. Every mile now became a small battle. The waves grew heavier, slamming into the boat's hull with patient, punishing blows. The wind howled through the anchor ropes like the whistles of long-lost sailors. Nick hunched over the wheel, knuckles white, eyes locked on the faint silhouette of land far ahead. He was not afraid of the sea. But today, he did not have the right to fail, not for his own sake. Behind him, Marilla remained silent. He glanced over his shoulder. She lay low, her head resting against a tied-down canvas sack. Her eyes were half open, dazed yet present. But what struck Nick most, she wasn't panicked. She didn't flinch. She didn't try to flee. She believed he would get her to safety. And it was that belief, that quiet, unbearable faith, that made him grip the wheel harder. Even as wave after wave struck the hull, skewing the vessel off course. Rain began to fall, not in torrents at first, just in cold, deliberate drops, each one like a needle piercing through his worn jacket, seeping into his collar, trailing down his back. The sea whipped up into frothy whitecaps. The gray mass of cloud now blanketed half the sky. Nick knew, if he didn't make it in time, neither of them would survive. Then he saw it. A break between 2 rows of dark stone, a gap like a doorway into another world. No crashing surf, no screaming wind, a quiet inlet, protected by treacherous cliffs. That was it, Naval Resupply Station Number 7. The place no modern map remembered. Nick yanked the wheel hard. The turn nearly capsized the boat, causing Marilla to roll slightly, letting out a soft growl of pain. He quickly eased the throttle and jumped down to check on her. She was all right, though clearly drained. But her eyes, they hadn't changed. No blame, no fear, only one thing: trust. They drifted into the stone passage just as the rain turned violent, tearing across the sea's surface like claws. But within the cove, the water was calm, still as a sleeping lake. Nick dropped anchor before a rotting dock, its beams splintered and green with moss. Concrete blocks jutted like bones from the past. But to him, in that moment, it was paradise. A pickup truck waited near the old path leading into the trees. A man stood beside it, baseball cap pulled low, coat zipped against the cold. His eyes widened as he saw Marilla slowly climb from the boat. "My God," he whispered. Nick didn't answer. He just nodded, as if to say, "I know, don't ask." Together, they guided Marilla onto a wooden sled and dragged it along the gravel path. She didn't resist. She simply walked, step by slow step, toward the hidden sanctuary within the green thickets. Each step she took declared, "I am not dead, I am alive, and I am still moving." Nick walked beside her, soaked from the storm. His lips were tight, but his chest swelled with something he had no name for. He had brought her here, not to live as a beast in a cage, but as a creature who deserved a second chance. The rain still fell in a light mist as Marilla took her first steps on forest soil. Beneath her paws, damp leaves and soft moss intertwined like a wild, unfamiliar carpet, gentle and strange after days adrift on the sea. Her back trembled with each step, as though relearning how to place her weight on solid ground. But none of the 3 beings present, Nick, the old friend, and Marilla, said a word. They didn't need to. They were stepping into something sacred. Ahead stood a weathered wooden gate, flanked by climbing vines, Faded letters spelled out, "Sanctuary Number 4 authorized personnel only." Beyond it stretched a vast, enclosed space, not built to imprison, but to restore. A clear freshwater pool, tall grasses, ancient trees that offered shade, and stone outcrops large enough for a lion to rest. An isolated forest, cut off from the noisy world. And today, it opened for a survivor no one had expected. Nick walked slowly beside Morella. His coat was drenched, salt and pepper hair matted to his forehead, eyes sunken from nearly 3 sleepless nights. Yet he walked tall, hands gripping his battered medical kit like this journey, this escort, was his final duty, that of a soldier, a husband, and a man who once lost his way. Morella stopped at the gate. She didn't enter, just stood still. The wind from the forest blew gently, bringing the scent of wet earth, leaves, and the distant sound of unseen creatures. She lifted her head, breathed it in, her tail gave a faint flick. Then, as if hearing a signal only she could detect, she turned back and looked at Nick. That gaze, it wasn't thanks, it wasn't farewell, it was recognition, a deep, wordless respect between two beings who had crossed the boundary of instinct together. Nick stood frozen, her eyes pierced through him, unraveling memories. Marie laughing in the kitchen over hot tea. The night waves of the Pacific. The blood-dried arm he once grasped in war. And Morella, placing her soaked paw on the edge of his boat like a silent pact between the dying and the one who had once given up on life. He said nothing. He simply nodded, a slight bow of the head, as if to say, "You no longer need me to lead you. Freedom lies ahead." And Morella walked through. No hesitation, no backward glance, just a quiet dip of the head, and that pale golden figure vanished into the trees. Like a dream retreating into the hush of the wild. Nick remained standing. At some point, the rain had stopped. There was no more sound of waves. Only the stillness of something completed. Behind him, his friend, the sanctuary's manager, spoke softly. "You sure you don't want to take one last look?" Nick shook his head, lips pressed firm, but steady. "No need. She's not someone you look back on. She's someone you remember." And he stepped back, out of the forest's threshold. Not because the rescue was over, but because a redemption had been fulfilled. A lioness had found her way back to nature. And a man, at last, had found his way back to himself. In the weeks that followed, Nick no longer drifted across the sea as he once had. The 30-year-old wooden boat was now carefully moored at the old dock. Scrubbed clean every morning, not in preparation for a voyage, but as a ritual of remembrance. A tribute to a journey that had come to an end. The townsfolk by the harbor began whispering about the old man with the lion. Children waved when he passed the wharf. And even the old fisherman, who once found him cold and distant, now offered greetings. No one truly believed the story. But no one could deny the new light in his eyes. Nick had changed. Not loudly. Not suddenly. But like an undercurrent that had finally reached the shore. Every Sunday morning, he left town with a crate of fresh fish, a folding chair, and a tin of peppermint tea, Marie's favorite scent. He sat beneath a large acacia tree in the sanctuary, in a spot where only familiar staff were allowed. Not too close, not too far, just enough for Morella to know he was there. At first, she didn't appear, only rustling leaves, a few pawprints in the damp soil, and that quiet, unmistakable feeling of being watched. But Nick waited. He wasn't there to expect anything. He simply sat, like a sentry no longer holding a weapon, only holding on to faith. In the 4th week, Morella appeared. She didn't fully emerge, just stood in the brush, her golden gaze sweeping over him, then vanished. By the 7th week, she came closer. One afternoon, with sunlight slanting through the leaves, Morella stretched herself along a stone slab. About 20 paces away, she didn't move, didn't retreat. She was simply there. And so, week by week, they shared the quiet together. Not as man and lion, but as two beings once adrift, once wounded, once lost, now finding stillness in the same forest. The sanctuary manager called her a miraculous creature. She healed rapidly, wounds closed, her stride strong again, and she reconnected with the wild as if betrayal had never scarred her. But something was different. Morella didn't roar, didn't rage. She was silent, almost contemplative. Many visitors said they felt something when they looked into her eyes. Not fear, Not curiosity, but the sensation of being seen. One day, someone asked Nick to share the story. At first, he declined, but later that night, he opened an old drawer, still holding a wedding photo of him and Marie, her curly hair. That smile that had once dissolved every wound in his life. And he thought, if Marie were alive, she would tell this story. She would call it a ballad, not of strangeness, but of redemption. So, at a fundraiser evening for the sanctuary, Nick stood on a small stage. Under soft amber lights, he spoke of that calm morning on the sea. Of Marella, of an unspoken plea in amber eyes. And the choice he made, when there were no more maps. No more orders, no one left to lead him except the quiet call of compassion. He ended with one line. She didn't swim to survive. She swam to find someone. The room fell silent, not because they understood, but because they felt it. The next day, the forest plot Marella now called home received a name. The Marella enclosure. Beneath the wooden sign, a small inscription read, "For all those who were never meant to be alone." Nick attended the dedication. He sat beneath the acacia tree, tea flask by his feet, eyes scanning the tree line. He didn't expect anything. He wasn't waiting. But then, through the dappled shadows, Marella emerged. No hesitation, no fear. She walked toward him, and without a sound, lay beside him, her head resting gently against the wooden chair. Nick turned to her, his heart catching in his chest. Because of the completeness of the silence between them. "I missed you too," he whispered. And in the rustling leaves above, Nick felt Marie near, not as a memory, not as a ghost, but as part of the quiet miracle he had chosen not to turn away from. The seaside town where Nick once lived had never been a place for strange things. Life there followed the tides and fishing seasons. People believed in what was real, hard work. Sturdy hands, putting on a coat when it rained, casting shade when it didn't. But after the day Nick brought a lioness back from the edge of death, everything changed, slowly. Yes, but irreversibly. People began calling him by a new name. The Lion Man, not mockingly, but as the town's quiet way of acknowledging him. The man who brought back not just a story, but a flicker of light in their shared memory. Children asked him about Marella the way they'd ask about legends. The grown-ups, though silent, glanced at his old boat each time they passed it, as if something sacred had once happened there, and perhaps still lingered. Nick never told the story as a tale of wonder. He didn't focus on a lion in the middle of the sea. He didn't speak of blood, or storms, or death-defying turns. He told it as a story about choice, about trust, between two beings who had nothing left to lose. And he always ended it with the same line, one that everyone remembered. She didn't swim to survive. She swam to find someone. Since the sanctuary officially named the forest after Marella, donations had doubled. People didn't come to see a rare animal. They came to feel the presence of something that had survived. Something that had passed through despair and emerged gentle. Marella was never tamed. She didn't let anyone touch her. She didn't perform, but she stayed close, always silent, half seen in the forest shadows, as if she were part of the land's spirit. Some said that when they walked past, she would watch them, and her gaze made them feel less alone. Nick still visited every Sunday. Sometimes, he'd sit the whole afternoon and never see her, but he was never disappointed. He understood. Freedom doesn't always show itself. But it's there, like memory, like Marie, like the part of himself that Marella had awakened, the part that still wanted to believe in good things. That still wanted to live, to love, to care for something weaker than himself. One late autumn afternoon, as golden leaves blanketed the base of their familiar acacia tree, Marella appeared again. No signal, no sound. She simply walked forward, gently. And for the first time, she didn't stop at a distance. She sat beside him. Her shoulder brushed the edge of his wooden chair. Nick didn't turn. He only spoke, his voice like wind. "So, you're staying, after all." There was no roar, no wild gusts of wind. Only a profound stillness he thought he'd lost since the day his wife passed. This was not just the end of a rescue. It was a rebirth, of a discarded lioness, of a man who had once lived without reason, and of the belief that, in a world full of wounds, sometimes the most irrational thing is the one most worth doing. Marella's story didn't need textbooks. It lived in whispers, in the eyes of children dreaming of the sea, in the hands of someone who chooses to embrace, instead of turn away, and in a small coastal town, beside an old boat that was always kept clean. An old man still made it his habit to polish it every morning. Not to sail again, but to remind himself that once, the sea brought him something he never dared believe in, and he had been brave enough to hold on to it. No one truly knows why a lion appeared in the middle of the sea. There is no scientific theory complete enough, no explanation that feels fully satisfying. But there is one thing that needs no understanding to be believed. Morella swam because she needed someone. And Nick, a man who had once chosen solitude as his only companion, became the final shore between the world and oblivion. They were not of the same species, not of the same language, only of the same thing: loss, and the quiet longing to be seen by another. The story didn't end when Morella stepped into the forest. It still lives, in the silence of each Sunday, in the watchful eyes from a distance, in a man waiting beneath a tree, with a crate of fish and an old tin of tea. He asks for nothing, only to know that someone is still alive, still remembered, and still free. And perhaps, the greatest miracle the ocean ever brought ashore was never a strange creature, but a second chance, for both sides of the world.